Good morning. My name is Renita Thomas. I have been a primary therapist here at Sierra Tucson for going on 6 months. The reason why I chose to do a domestic violence presentation is because I have had the fortunate experience of, number one, working with court-ordered treatment to provide domestic violence treatment to offenders once they are out of incarceration. And I have worked in the jail for close to 3 years where I have seen the experience of domestic violence offenders. So my experience as a group facilitator and also a mental health therapist providing treatment to domestic violence offenders in the jail has created some passion for this assignment for me. So um, thank you for joining me again. What I'm going to do right now is close down the webcam and I'll reopen when the presentation is done for questions. Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is how many people are actually impacted by domestic violence. What are some risk factors associated with that kind of lead to domestic violence behaviors? How do we know if someone is actually experiencing domestic violence? And we're going to identify that by using the power and control wheel as well as the equality wheel, which is the complete opposite. We're also going to talk about how do we treat the problem, not just for offenders, but for victims as well. And what is the effectiveness of that? Okay, so what exactly is domestic violence? A lot of people have mixed thoughts and feelings about this. Offenders don't exactly know that they have behaved in a domestic violence kind of a way. And victims have often been confused or not necessarily realizing that they have been a victim, a real victim of domestic violence. So, what it actually is a pattern of behavior in a domestic setting, meaning where the people live or within a marriage that is used to exert power and control over another person. Now, domestic violence can also occur between biological family members, and that looks like violence between parents and children, vice versa, or sibling related violence. Now, domestic violence is often confused with the term intimate partner violence, but IPV only covers non marital romantic relationships in any setting. So, the purpose of the behaviors is to exert power by scaring a person, trying to manipulate them. We call that can also be referred to as gaslighting, hurting in some form of fashion, blaming, using humiliation in order to control the behaviors of the person, getting them to do what the offender wants them to do. So a lot of times people say, well, how can this happen? How could he or she become so violent? What caused this? So some of the common causes and or risk factors include experiencing emotional or physical abuse as a child, being raised in a dysfunctional family where the child experiences some kind of abuse between parents, stress of low income and or unemployment challenges. Oftentimes people have unmanaged aggression or antisocial personality traits that bleed over into their relationships. There's also unhealthy attachment styles such as codependency. Substance abuse also plays a factor, as well as a dissatisfaction within your relationship. And the challenge with dissatisfaction in a relationship is that the people are not using healthy communication styles to express their genuine thoughts and feelings. And there's also the cognitive distortions related to masculine pride or machismo. And that can be seen often in generational family styles. So what I've done was drawn some statistics based on 2021 from reports of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And it looks like 8 million workdays are lost each year by victims because of things related to domestic violence, such as shame. Perhaps they don't want to be seen by their coworkers or even have to admit that they're experiencing some kind of violence in their relationship. There's fear factor of possibly running into the offender. There's physical challenges as a result of the physical abuse, causing challenges with performing work related tasks and court issues. Oftentimes, victims have to go to several court dates, which interfere with being able to show up to work. Um, Another statistic is that the unresolved trauma, grief, hurt, and shame that victims experience is associated with higher rates of depression and suicidal behaviors, as well as anxiety and PTSD. It's a surprise, but about 20 people per minute, that's about 20 people per 60 seconds, experience physical abuse in an intimate relationship. And there is an average of 20,000 calls per day to the domestic violence hotline. I have to be honest, when I came across that with all of my experience, I was still very surprised about that. So, what does domestic violence actually look like? Again, because some people don't realize, a lot of offenders don't realize that they have been displaying these kind of behaviors for a long time, and the victims don't realize that they have been exposed to this behavior for an extended period of time. All right. So the power and control wheel, as well as the equality wheel, is used as a tool within the Duluth treatment model. And the purpose is to help bring awareness to the offenders as well as the victims, how they have been experiencing these kinds of dysfunctions throughout their relationship. So not sure if you can see everything, so I'll just try to highlight as we go along. So the first one is using intimidation. And what exactly does that look like? That looks like making him or her afraid by using looks, grimaces, actions, and gestures. That's usually posturing. Also, breaking things. Oftentimes, I've heard of partners breaking each other's cell phones, throwing them up against the wall, and they never realized that that was a domestic violence act. Also, abusing pets as a form of manipulation and displaying weapons. The person might not have had the intent to actually use the weapon, but just showing the weapon to the victim is a form of fear. So, using emotional abuse, that looks like putting him or her down, making them feel bad about themselves, and calling them names. A lot of times, victims never realize that being called names over an extended period of time was actually traumatic. Also, playing mind games. We talked about gaslighting, humiliation, and making them feel guilty for things of which they should not have any guilty feelings for. Also, using isolation. This looks like trying to keep the victim away from their support systems, limiting outside involvement. And this looks like trying to prevent the partner from getting a job, having a social life, and using jealousy to justify their actions. Minimizing and denying or blaming. And that looks like making light of the situation. If the victim approaches the abuser and says, "Hey, I didn't like the way I was treated," the offender typically says things like, "Well, it wasn't a big deal." Actually, not even acknowledging that the abuse even occurred, or maybe even saying that the victim caused it. It was their fault that they ended up being humiliated, shamed, or even physically hurt. Oftentimes, using children as leverage. As terrible as it sounds, children often get used to make the victim feel guilty about something. And this just goes back to the child being exposed to a dysfunctional family. Using male privilege, and that looks like treating the partner like a servant, making all the decisions, kind of feeling like the master of the house, what I say goes kind of an attitude. Economic abuse, and that looks like preventing the victim from getting a job, making them have to ask for money, creating things like allowance, even taking their money and not letting them know what money is being spent on throughout the house, even outside of the house. And also coercion and threats. And that looks like literally threatening to hurt a person. Might not have the actual intent to do it, but the purpose behind the threat is to cause some kind of fear, which will determine the behavior that the victim will engage in. Okay, so how do we combat that? The purpose of the equality wheel is to demonstrate how to take these abusive behaviors and turn them around to where there's some equality in the relationship. Okay, so non-threatening behaviors looks like actually taking away anything that can be perceived as a threat. Um, Doing something that can make the victim or each person in the relationship feel comfortable to express their wants and needs. The basics of having simple respect for one another. That looks like listening. That looks like having a non judgmental attitude, valuing one's differences and opinions, and using active listening skills to where the other person feels understood and validated. What does trust and support looks like? That looks like having a respect for one's own feelings, and honesty and accountability, that looks like literally accepting accountability for your own actions without the gaslighting, without the blaming and shaming, and admitting to being wrong and communicating openly and honestly in a relationship. Responsible parenting, that looks like equal parenting responsibilities. There are much less male female roles in that relationship where the male is just to go out and work and kind of put food on the table, where the female is in charge of everything under the sun related to parenting. So there's a lot of help in that relationship. Shared responsibilities, that just goes back to a fair distribution of household duties, making family decisions together. And economic partnership is the very same thing, having having camaraderie in terms of what money is spent on, and actually both partners benefiting from income, whereas one person doesn't have to feel like they have to ask for money. And negotiating and fairness, and that is just respectfully resolving conflict, being solution focused and having a willingness to compromise. Okay. Okay, so treatment for abusers. Like I said, I've had the privilege of kind of working both sides of the fence, where I saw the process where the offender came into the jail and had to go through the political expectations amongst other offenders while incarceration, excuse me, and then having to come out, and as a result of being on probation, having to go to several domestic violence classes where the purpose was to curtail these domestic violence thoughts and behaviors. So the treatment ranges between 16 and 52 classes of what is called a Duluth or CBT psychoeducational group. Now, it depends on the classes depend on the judge's thoughts and feelings, as well as the treatment facility's thoughts and feelings. So, example, I have seen a first offender only receive 15 mandated classes for treatment. I've also seen a first offender who used a weapon in the domestic violence situation get 52 expected classes. So it just depends on the circumstances. So regardless of the treatment model, whether it be Duluth or CBT, in my opinion, the most effective strategy is when law enforcement is involved, because that's an extra blanket of accountability. Also, when the treatment does not allow collusion. So collusion looks like group peers kind of agreeing with each other, talking about bad behaviors, glorifying disrespectful, abusive behaviors, and developing a camaraderie against about it, to where they're not open and receptive to non-combative ways of doing it. Also, I've seen that victim empathy is very effective, because most of the times when a domestic violence offender is acting, they're not taking into consideration how the victim feels. What are the cause and effects of this? Is this going to lead to the victim not being able to show up to work? Is this going to result in them losing their jobs? So having an overall empathy and concept of how their behaviors affects others has been extremely effective, as well as the baselines of learning appropriate communication skills, taking accountability for your actions, which totally combats the collusion aspect. Also having healthy boundaries, and that looks like challenging codependency, jealousy, envy, um, causes the offender to take a consideration into internal boundaries as well. Okay. So what does domestic violence treatment for the victim look like? So because victims have different backgrounds, different traumatic experiences that can range from sexual trauma, emotional trauma, and physical trauma, taking into consideration their family upbringing, culture, what they thought was expected of them. There's really no cookie cutter or one treatment fits all modality for victims. But studies have shown that treatment then includes ongoing safety skills, such as teaching how to protect oneself in the community, basically having your keys in your hand before you get to the car, instead of fumbling through your purse to open the door, so that you can get to your car safe. Having an awareness of who's around you, parking underneath lights in the, when you go to the grocery store, not being so quick to jump into relationships and consider all factors involved. Trauma therapy, and that goes right back to addressing the emotional trauma, the physical trauma, the sexual trauma. Also empowering women. A lot of times victims, male or female, don't realize exactly how much control they actually have in a situation, making them feel like they are victims and it's hopeless. We're actually, well, actually, they can be empowered to make use of a lot of resources that they may not have realized were available in the first place. What I have seen in my experience is that advocacy, victim advocacy plays a major role, because it provides the victim an additional support and resources that they might not have access to. So what has been the effectiveness? Studies show that telephone and hotline interventions actually increase the safe behaviors of victims. Going back to victim treatment, studies show that improved physical functioning, less emotional abuse, and lower symptoms of depression occur in victims who were given coping skills for empowerment. Advocacy for victims showed a decrease and a re-abuse and increase in quality of life. And for the abusers, less physical violence up to 1 year post domestic violence treatment was reported for abusers. Now, unfortunately, 25% of husbands remained, only 25% remained nonviolent. Now, I guess that this could be due to lack of marital support once domestic violence treatment is over. So a good aftercare might be setting up some couples therapy. The Duluth model has proven not to be most effective, but in my experience, I have seen this work. And typically, those who are forced into treatment, whether it be by the judge, probation, or circumstances, typically don't have a sense of respect or trust for the judicial system. Whereas those people who kind of enroll themselves in domestic violence treatment voluntarily typically have a greater success rate. Okay, so October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And I chose to show this hotline number just in case yourselves or anyone else needs this information. So I'm going to turn the camera on right now and get ready for some questions. Oh. Okay, so one question that I see, thank you very much, is should domestic violence be taught in the jail or the prison system? My answer to that is absolutely, because when offenders go into the jail or prison, there's a lot of political expectations amongst the offenders, where oftentimes the offenders are subjected to being uh, brutally exposed to violence themselves. It's a form of punishment that the offenders use towards each other in their idea of decreasing the recidivism of inmates coming back for domestic violence issues. But the problem is that when that occurs, it's more like a punishment, whereas domestic violence offenders within the system should be exposed to victim empathy, accountability, even trauma work for themselves that would prepare them for going into treatment post release, which makes them more receptible and more aware and more conscious of what they're going to be walking into, which could probably increase the success rate of their treatment. Okay, so it looks like we're running out of time and I'm not able to answer any more questions, but I want to thank you for joining me today and thank you for your time. And I hope that this was helpful to all of you. Good day.